My parents left me $1 in the estate, then Grandpa's safe contained another second will. The dollar bill was newer than I expected, crisp, still carrying the faint chemical smell of a bank wrapper, as if someone had walked into a branch that morning and asked for exactly one bill and nothing more. I noticed that detail before I understood what it meant, that whoever chose it had gone out of their way to find one that wasn't wrinkled. My mother wouldn't have wanted it to look careless. She wouldn't have wanted it to look like an afterthought, even while making sure I understood I was one. Jonathan Vale's office smelled like cedar and old paper, the particular staleness of a room built for difficult conversations delivered on schedule, with a box of tissues placed close enough to reach but never directly in front of anyone, as if that alone might suggest weakness. He sat behind a desk with a folder in front of him, and across from him sat my sister Cecilia, our Aunt Abina, our Uncle Kendrick, and me, in a row of chairs too formal for the size of the loss we were carrying into that room. My parents had been gone 11 days. Luke and Solange Whitfield, married 31 years, killed on a wet stretch of highway coming back from a cousin's engagement dinner. Neither of them had particularly wanted to attend. I had spent those 11 days organizing a funeral, answering condolence texts I couldn't read twice, and telling myself that whatever came next in that lawyer's office would be a formality, a signature, a number, something administrative I could get through and then go home and actually grieve. Jonathan opened the folder and read the distribution the way attorneys are trained to read things. Flat, even, giving nothing away with his voice, which somehow made it worse. The house went to Cecilia, along with the investment accounts and my father's half of the family hardware business. A modest trust for our cousin's college fund, courtesy of my mother. And then to me, their younger daughter, $1. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because my body didn't have a category for what it was feeling, and laughing was the closest reflex available. Cecilia's hand found my knee, but she didn't look surprised, not the way I needed her to be. Kendrick studied the carpet. Abena's eyes went glassy in a way I would only understand the significance of much later. "There's no letter," Jonathan said gently before I could ask. "No explanation attached to the distribution. I know that raises questions. I'm sorry I don't have more for you." $1, not zero. My parents could have written my name out of that document entirely, and instead they'd chosen a number just barely above nothing, a number that required someone to walk into a bank and hand over a bill on purpose. I would spend the next several weeks believing that number was the cruelest kind of message a parent could leave a child. You existed to us, but only just. I had no idea yet that the amount wasn't cruelty. It was a door left open a crack, and none of us in that office were equipped to see it as anything but a door being shut. If there's one thing I've learned since, watching stories like this one unfold inside families that look nothing alike but somehow ache in the same places, it's that the moments which seem the smallest are usually the ones doing the most work. A dollar bill. A safe nobody remembers the combination to. A sentence someone says once and you don't think about again for 15 years. If you're the kind of person who likes watching a quiet detail turn into the whole truth, stay close to Milan Folktales. The stories here rarely start where they end, and this is one of the strangest, quietest examples I've ever lived through. Cecilia took me to lunch afterward, guilt radiating off her in a way that made me want to comfort her more than I wanted to be comforted myself, which has always been my particular flaw, smoothing things over before I've let myself feel them. "I can split what I got with you," she said, pushing a plate she hadn't touched toward the center of the table. "Right now. Today. I don't need Jonathan's office for that. I don't want your charity, Cecilia. It's not charity. It's fairness." "Then why didn't Mom and Dad think it was fair?" I asked, and I watched her flinch, because she didn't have an answer, and because some part of both of us understood that whatever she offered me at that table would only ever be a patch over the actual wound. Money moved between sisters can undo a debt. It can't undo the fact that our parents had chosen, deliberately, on paper, in front of a lawyer, to make me the exception. "They must have had a reason," she said again, quieter this time, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. I'm sure they did, I said. I just don't think it was the one Kendrick keeps offering everyone. She didn't push back on that. She just looked at her plate for a long moment and said, "You always did see things the rest of us miss." Kendrick, for his part, offered the explanation the rest of the family would repeat for weeks, like a rehearsed line. That I'd broken my parents' hearts when I left for design school at 19 instead of joining the family business. That the fight I'd had with my father that year, the one where I told him I didn't want to spend my life restocking paint cans and he told me I was throwing away everything he'd built, had apparently never healed the way I thought it had. "You know how your dad held on to things," Kendrick said, not unkindly, but with the ease of a man repeating a story he found convenient. Abina said nothing at the time. I noticed that too, eventually. For 2 years after that fight, my father and I had barely spoken beyond holidays. We found our way back slowly. A phone call here, a visit there, an olive branch disguised as him asking my opinion on a kitchen renovation. By the time he died, we were not close in the way we'd been when I was a child, sitting on the hardware store's back steps while he explained the difference between a compression fitting and a push fitting like it was poetry. But we were not estranged either. We had dinner 4 times in the last year of his life. My mother had cried, once, telling me how relieved she was that Luke and I had found our way back to each other. That memory sat like a stone in my chest every time someone in the family repeated Kendrick's explanation, because it didn't match. Grief doesn't leave $1. Reconciliation doesn't leave $1. Something else had. The one person who might have told me the truth outright was already gone. My grandfather, Gregory Whitfield, had died 4 years earlier, and in the strange logistics of estates and probate, his old house on Cardigan Street, the one he'd built his real estate business from, the one none of us had ever gotten around to selling, was still sitting there, half-furnished, technically part of what remained to be settled now that my father, his executor, was gone too. Someone needed to finish cataloging it. Cecilia, drowning in the hardware store's transition paperwork, asked if I would take it on. "You were always his favorite anyway," she said, and I remember thinking that was the first sentence anyone had said to me all week that didn't feel like an apology. Abena caught up with me in the parking lot after that lunch, while Cecilia was still settling the check inside. My aunt has always had a way of saying the least amount possible and somehow making it land the hardest. "Don't let Kendrick's version of your father become the only one you carry," she said. "What does that mean?" "It means your father was a complicated man who loved you in ways he was bad at showing. And $1 doesn't erase 30 years of that, no matter how much it feels like it does today." She squeezed my arm once, briefly, the way she'd done since I was a child, too proud to ask for comfort directly. "Go easy on yourself before you go looking for answers. Whatever you find isn't going anywhere." I didn't understand, in that moment, that she was telling me to go looking at all. I only understood it weeks later, once I already had. Grandpa Gregory had been a difficult man to love easily, and an easy man to admire from a distance. A former commercial property developer who'd built half the strip malls and low-rise apartment buildings in 3 counties. Sharp enough with numbers that even my father deferred to him on anything involving money, and quiet enough with feelings that most of the family had stopped trying to reach him by the time I was a teenager. I hadn't stopped. I used to sit with him on his back porch, while he told me which buildings he was proud of and which ones he regretted selling too soon. And once, when I was maybe 16, he said something I filed away without understanding. "The things worth keeping, Imara, are never kept where anyone expects to find them." I'd assumed he was talking about a rental property he'd hidden from a bad business partner decades earlier. I didn't think about that sentence again until I was standing in his empty living room with a box of estate inventory forms, wondering why a dollar bill was still sitting in my coat pocket like it had something left to say. I started at Cardigan Street on a Tuesday. The house still smelled like him. Pipe tobacco he'd quit 20 years ago, but that had somehow soaked permanently into the drywall. And the particular mustiness of a home whose windows hadn't been opened in longer than they should have been. I told myself I was there to finish a job, sort furniture, photograph valuables for the estate file, flag anything Jonathan's office needed for the final accounting. I did not tell myself I was looking for anything, because I didn't yet know there was anything to find. It took me 3 days to reach the study, and it was there, behind a bookshelf my grandfather had built himself out of reclaimed oak, that I noticed the wall didn't quite match. A seam, a rectangle slightly too clean for 80-year-old plaster. My hands were shaking before my mind had caught up to why. I want to be honest about what those 3 days were, because they mattered more than the discovery itself. Cataloging a dead man's house is not the montage people imagine. It's slow. It's a box of mismatched drawer pulls next to a box of tax returns from 1987. It's finding your grandmother's wedding ring, which everyone assumed had been buried with her, sitting in a cufflink dish like an afterthought, and having to stop working for 20 minutes because grief doesn't wait for a convenient moment. By the time I reached the study, I'd already stopped believing the house had secrets. I thought it just had grief, arranged by category. The bookshelf moved easier than it should have for something that size. On hinges I hadn't noticed because they'd been fitted flush into the frame. Behind it sat a floor safe, old, the kind with a brass dial instead of a keypad, bolted into the foundation itself, rather than sitting loose against the wall. My father, as executor of Grandpa's estate 4 years earlier, had apparently known about a safe. Jonathan's original probate file mentioned one, briefly, noted as contents unknown, combination not located, presumed empty or non-material. Nobody had pushed harder than that. Grief makes people accept convenient explanations, and an empty safe is a very convenient thing to believe. I sat on the study floor for over an hour trying birthdays. My grandfather's, my grandmother's, my father's. Nothing turned the dial. At one point, I called Cecilia just to hear another voice in the house that wasn't my own thinking out loud. "You found a what?" she said. "A safe, behind the bookshelf in the study. I don't think anyone's opened it since Grandpa died. Dad's file said it was empty." "Dad's file said presumed empty," I said. "Those aren't the same thing." There was a pause on her end, long enough that I could hear her weighing whether to say what she said next. "Be careful what you go digging for, Imara. Sometimes things get left alone for a reason." I didn't have an answer for that yet, so I hung up and went back to the dial. It was only when I was ready to give up, sitting back against the cold wall, that his sentence came back to me. The things worth keeping are never kept where anyone expects to find them. And underneath it, another memory I hadn't thought about in over a decade. The address of the very first building he ever bought, a rundown 4-unit on Halsey Avenue, he used to call the one that taught me everything, which he'd sold at what he always described as the worst financial decision of his career, letting sentiment beat him at his own game for the only time in his life. I tried the numbers. 1419. The dial gave, and the door came open with a sound like a held breath finally let out. Inside were 3 things: a property deed, folded and yellowed, for a commercial building on Halsey Avenue. The same building, still standing, still generating rental income through a management company nobody in the family had ever asked questions about, because everyone assumed it belonged to the estate that had already been settled. A sealed envelope with my name on it, in my grandfather's handwriting, the ink slightly faded but the letters unmistakably his, sharp and economical the way everything about him had been. And a will, dated 11 months before he died, never filed. Never mentioned to Jonathan, or to my father, or to anyone. I didn't open the envelope first. I read the will, because some instinct told me the envelope would make more sense once I understood what it was responding to, and I was right. The will was short. Grandpa hated wasted language, and it did something I wasn't prepared for. It didn't leave me the entire estate. It didn't make me suddenly wealthy. It left me one specific asset, the Halsey Avenue building, held not outright but inside a small trust, with a single condition attached. The trust could not be touched, sold, mortgaged, or liquidated by anyone other than me, and it explicitly excluded, by name, my Uncle Kendrick from ever serving as trustee, co-signer, or beneficiary of any portion of it, for reasons my son Luke understands and has agreed to honor. My son Luke understands and has agreed to honor. I read that line maybe 6 times. My father had known about this will. My father had known about this building. And 4 years after Grandpa died, when my father was executor and could have filed it, could have told me any of it, he'd instead let the family believe the safe was empty, let the original will stand, and then, less than a year ago, signed his own estate documents, leaving me exactly $1. I want to be clear about what I believed in that moment, because I did believe something, and it was wrong, and I think that's important to say honestly, rather than pretending I arrived at the truth faster than I did. I believed my father had stolen from me. That he'd found Grandpa's will, recognized what it meant, and quietly buried it, because Kendrick, his younger brother, the one who'd always needed bailing out, the one whose hardware store franchise had failed twice on my father's money, before the family finally consolidated everything under one location, needed protecting more than I did. I believed the dollar wasn't rejection. It was worse. It was payment for my silence, or maybe just proof that he'd never intended me to find any of this at all, and the timing had simply run out before he could bury it more permanently. That was the false story. It held together perfectly for about 4 days, and it explained everything except the one detail I kept returning to. If my father had wanted this building gone from my life entirely, he never had to know I'd go looking. He could have destroyed the will himself, instead of leaving it sitting in a safe, with my name written on an envelope beside it, in a house he knew I'd eventually be asked to clear. I opened the envelope on a Thursday night, alone, sitting on the floor of my apartment with the deed spread out beside me, like evidence in a case I didn't yet understand I was building. My grandfather's handwriting again, longer this time, clearly written with more time and more difficulty than the will itself. Imara, if you're reading this, it means the safe outlived me the way I hoped it would, and it means someone finally needed to open it badly enough to remember what I told you on that porch. I'm sorry for the games. I built my whole life keeping things where people wouldn't look, and I couldn't stop myself doing it one last time, even with something this important. Halsey Avenue was never really about the building. It's about what almost happened to it 9 years ago, and what your uncle did, and what your father chose to do about it afterward. I won't write the whole story here. Luke deserves to be the one who tells you that part, if he ever finds the courage. And if he doesn't, ask Jonathan for the file marked with my initials. Not the estate file, the other one. What I need you to understand from me directly is this. The building was never meant to punish Kendrick. It was meant to protect what your father built to shield him. Ask about the loan before you ask about the will. The loan is where the truth actually starts. I read that last line 4 times before I understood it wasn't a metaphor. There was an actual loan, an actual document. And whatever it contained, my grandfather had trusted my father to eventually explain it to me himself. A trust my father had died without honoring, whether by choice or by the simple cruelty of a highway on a wet night that gave him no warning his time was running out. I called Jonathan the next morning and asked, as calmly as I could manage, whether there was a file in his office marked with my grandfather's initials that wasn't part of the standard estate record. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I knew before he answered that I'd just asked a question he'd been hoping nobody would ever ask him. "There is," he said finally. "Your grandfather asked me to hold it separately, years ago. He said only 2 people were ever allowed to request it, himself or you, and only if you asked, using those exact words. I have to be honest with you, Imara. I've been waiting 4 years for either your father or your grandfather to tell you to come ask me this, and neither of them ever did. Some family stories reveal themselves in one dramatic scene, delivered whole, like the truth simply couldn't wait any longer to be spoken. This wasn't that kind of story. It came apart in pieces, in a lawyer's careful pauses, and an old man's handwriting, and a building I'd walked past dozens of times without ever knowing my name was quietly attached to it. If you've ever inherited a piece of your family's silence, instead of an answer, you already know that the discovery is never really the ending. It's just the moment the real questions finally get to start. I'll be honest, This is the part of Milan Folktales stories I love telling the most. The part where nobody's a villain yet, and nobody's innocent either. And I hope you're still here with me when the shape of it finally becomes clear. I drove to Jonathan's office that same afternoon. He met me at the door himself instead of sending his assistant, and the folder he carried into the conference room was thinner than I expected, thin enough that I almost asked if he was sure he'd brought the right one. He set it down without opening it and looked at me the way people look at you, right before they hand you something they wish they didn't have to. "Before I open this," he said, "I need you to understand that your father asked me, more than once, whether you'd ever come looking. He never told me what he wanted me to say if you did. I think, in the end, he was hoping he'd get to say it himself." The file contained a loan agreement, 9 years old, and a letter from my grandfather that read less like an explanation and more like a confession he'd never wanted to write down. 9 years earlier, Kendrick's first hardware franchise had been 18 months from bankruptcy, quietly, in the way small businesses fail, not with one dramatic collapse, but with a slow accumulation of missed payments. Nobody outside the family noticed, until it was almost too late. Kendrick had gone to Grandpa for a loan to cover a supplier debt and keep the doors open through a bad season, and Grandpa, against his own better judgment, had agreed, on the condition that the loan be properly documented and secured the way he'd secure any real transaction, using the Halsey Avenue building as collateral, since it was fully paid off and Kendrick had nothing else of value to offer. What Grandpa discovered 8 months later, going through his own paperwork after a routine call from his bank about an unfamiliar inquiry on the property, was that Kendrick had gone back to that same collateral a second time, without telling him, taking out a separate loan from a different lender, using a forged authorization that mimicked Grandpa's signature closely enough to pass a teller's glance, but not close enough to survive a second look from a man who'd signed his own name on legal documents for 50 years. Grandpa never reported it. That was the piece that broke something loose in my chest as I read it. Not the forgery itself, but the choice that followed it. He called my father instead of the police. The two of them worked out a private arrangement. Luke would quietly guarantee and eventually absorb the fraudulent loan himself, paying it down over several years, using money from the hardware business's own accounts so it would never surface as a family scandal. And Kendrick would never be told that anyone besides Grandpa and my father knew what he'd done. In exchange, Grandpa made one demand my father agreed to without argument, that the Halsey Avenue building itself, the thing Kendrick had tried to quietly gamble away twice, would never pass to Kendrick, or to anyone who might one day let him near it again. It would go to me instead, the grandchild Grandpa trusted least to ever need protecting from her own family's worst impulses, because I was the one who'd left the business entirely and had nothing to gain from touching it. That was the second revelation, and it was the one that actually hurt, more than the dollar ever had. Not because my father had lied to me, because he'd spent years quietly paying off another man's fraud with money that could have gone toward literally anything else. My education, a down payment, an emergency fund he never let himself build because he was busy building mine. If I ever needed the version of him that would fight for me the way he'd apparently been fighting silently for years. He never told me. He never told Cecilia either. He let all of us believe Kendrick's hardware failures were simple bad luck. Let all of us treat Kendrick with the easy warmth you extend to a slightly unlucky younger brother, while carrying the actual weight of what Kendrick had done entirely alone. The dollar, Jonathan finally explained, once I'd stopped needing a minute of silence to absorb the rest, wasn't rejection, and it wasn't payment for silence either. It was strategy, and a clumsy one, born out of exhaustion rather than cruelty. My father's estate attorney, not Jonathan, a different one he'd used for his personal will, separate from the family firm, had advised him that if he simply left me nothing, under our state's law, I would have almost no standing to ever formally contest the estate's distribution later, should the Halsey Avenue Trust ever need defending in court against a challenge from Kendrick's side of the family. A token amount, even a single dollar, preserved my legal status as an acknowledged beneficiary. It was a hedge, an imperfect, hastily built hedge, drawn up in the last year of his life, when his health had already started worrying my mother more than either of them told us. Done without ever finding the right moment to sit me down and explain why it looked the way it looked. He was going to tell you, Jonathan said. He told me that himself, the week he updated the will. He said he was waiting until Cecilia's transition at the store settled down, so it wouldn't feel like he was choosing between his daughters in the middle of everything else. He didn't know he was running out of time. I don't think I can adequately describe what it does to a person to learn that the thing they interpreted as their parents' final verdict on their worth was actually an unfinished sentence, one their father fully intended to complete, and simply never got the chance to. Grief has a way of rearranging itself entirely around new information. I had spent weeks grieving a rejection. Now I had to grieve a man who'd spent 9 quiet years protecting me from a truth he never got to deliver on his own terms, and I didn't know which version of that grief was heavier. There's a particular kind of loneliness in learning your family has been quietly reorganizing itself around a secret for almost a decade without you. If you've ever found out the version of events you grew up believing wasn't the full picture, you know that the hardest part isn't usually the secret itself. It's realizing how much of your own story you built on top of it without knowing. That's the thread I keep coming back to with stories like this one, and it's part of why I keep making them. If any of this feels familiar to you, stay with Milan Folktales, because the reckoning is where these stories usually find their truest shape, and this one still has more to give up before it's finished. The financial mystery didn't end there, though, because a document doesn't resolve on its own. It has to survive contact with the people it implicates, and Kendrick was still very much alive, and still, as it turned out, still quietly attached to that building. Jonathan had pulled the current title records before I arrived, and what they showed stopped me cold. 2 months before my parents died, Kendrick had applied for a home equity line of credit using the Halsey Avenue property as proposed collateral, listing himself as an authorized party based on an old, outdated power of attorney my father had signed years earlier during a hospitalization and never formally revoked, even after his recovery, simply because neither of them had thought to clean it up. How is that even possible, I asked, if the building was never in his name to begin with? It isn't, technically, Jonathan said, but a lending institution doesn't always dig that deep at the application stage, especially with a power of attorney attached and a family name the local bank already recognized. It would have been caught eventually. Underwriting would have flagged the discrepancy once they pulled a full title search, but eventually isn't the same as before any damage gets done. He tapped the file once, like he was trying to make the next part land clearly. If this had gone through even a few weeks earlier, before the second will surfaced, the trust protections your grandfather built wouldn't have existed yet in any recognized legal sense. The building would have been treated as ordinary estate property, tied up in whatever your father's original will said, which left it entirely inside Cecilia and Kendrick's side of the settlement. He would have gotten exactly what your grandfather spent 9 years making sure he never could. The application was still pending when I found it. Nobody at the lending institution had any way of knowing the building had, weeks earlier, effectively become mine under a will that had never been filed. Kendrick, I would come to understand, wasn't a cartoon villain circling an inheritance with malicious intent. He was a man who'd spent 9 years believing he'd successfully hidden a mistake, who genuinely didn't know the building carried any conditions on it, who had convinced himself over time that reaching for it again wasn't stealing so much as finally correcting an old imbalance. The older, more successful brother's family getting the house and the business while his own kept struggling. That didn't make what he'd done to Grandpa's signature forgivable. It made it human, which was somehow worse, because it meant there was no clean place to put my anger. Abina, when I finally called her that night, unable to hold the weight of it alone any longer, admitted quietly that she'd suspected something about Kendrick for years. Not the specifics, never the forgery, but a general unease she'd never been able to name. The way he always changed the subject too quickly when the hardware store's early struggles came up. The way my father had once asked her, out of nowhere, whether she thought family loyalty ever crossed into enabling. I told him loyalty without honesty just becomes a different kind of lie, she said. I don't think he ever told me what he meant by the question. I wish I'd pushed harder. I confronted Kendrick myself before Jonathan ever filed anything, because I owed my father's memory that much. A chance for his brother to explain himself to a person's face, rather than through an attorney's letter. I found him at the hardware store, restocking a shelf of drawer hardware like it was any other Tuesday, and when I said I needed to talk to him about Halsey Avenue, the color left his face before I'd said another word. I don't know what you think you found, he said. I found the loan, Kendrick, the real one. The one with your signature on it and Grandpa's forged onto the second. He set the box down very carefully, the way people do when their hands have started shaking and they don't want you to see it. Your father handled that, he said. He told me it was handled. He never once made me feel like I owed anyone an explanation for it. That's because he was the one paying for it, quietly, for 9 years, while you told everyone your business just had bad luck. You think I don't know what he did for me? His voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, I saw something closer to shame than defensiveness. You think I don't carry that every single day? I was drowning, Imara. I made one terrible decision when I was drowning, and your father turned it into something he carried instead of me, and I have spent every year since trying to be good enough to deserve that. Then why did you apply for a line of credit against a building you knew wasn't fully yours to touch? He didn't answer that one. He just looked at the shelf of drawer pulls like it might give him something to say, and I understood, standing there, that he wasn't going to lie to me outright. He simply wasn't going to answer at all, which told me everything the silence needed to. Cecilia's reaction, when I finally told her everything 2 days later, sitting in her kitchen with the deed between us like an artifact neither of us fully trusted yet, was the one that undid me the most. She didn't defend Kendrick. She didn't defend our father either, not really. She just sat very still for a long time, and then said, I told everyone you deserved the dollar because I needed there to be a reason that wasn't Dad choosing to protect Kendrick over protecting you. I think some part of me already knew, and I just didn't want to be the one who had to say it out loud. Money can expose the architecture of a family faster than any argument ever could. Who gets protected instinctively? Who gets protected only after enough damage is done, and who gets left to build their own protection from scratch, because everyone assumed she'd manage. I didn't say that to Cecilia that night. I only thought it, sitting in her kitchen, watching my sister finally let herself feel the guilt she'd been quietly circling for weeks. But it was true, and it was about to become the only thing standing between the Halsey Avenue building and a lending institution that had no idea it was about to become the center of a legal fight none of us had asked for. Jonathan filed the unfiled will within the week, which is a stranger process than most people realize. A will found years after a death doesn't simply take effect the moment someone reads it out loud. It has to be authenticated, entered into probate, and in this case, formally challenged, because the moment the Halsey Avenue Trust became public record, Kendrick's attorney contested it, arguing my grandfather lacked the capacity to have properly executed a second will so close to the end of his life, and that the original, filed will should stand as the only valid document. I won't pretend the months that followed were quick or clean. Probate court is not built for drama. It's built for documents. And the hearing itself, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic in its ordinariness. A judge in a plain courtroom, folders passed between attorneys, dates and signatures examined with the kind of dry, procedural attention that makes the stakes feel smaller than they are, right up until they don't. Jonathan had located the bank's original teller notes from the fraudulent loan 9 years earlier, notes that had never been destroyed because the branch that processed it had since been absorbed into a larger institution with better record retention than anyone anticipated. A handwriting analyst compared 4 documents: Grandpa's authentic signature, the forged authorization, my grandfather's private letter to Jonathan explaining the arrangement, and the second will itself. The pattern held together the way true things usually do when you finally lay them out side by side. The pressure variance on the forged document is consistent with someone tracing a signature slowly, rather than writing it naturally, the analyst told the judge, sliding the enlarged images across the table. The authentic signatures, including the one on the second will, show the fluid, rapid strokes of a person writing their own name without hesitation. Kendrick's attorney tried, briefly, to argue that even if the forgery was real, it had no bearing on whether Gregory Whitfield had the mental capacity to execute a new will 11 months before his death. Jonathan answered that one simply, without theatrics, sliding across a folder of my grandfather's business correspondence from that same period. Contracts negotiated, a property sale closed, a letter to his accountant sharp enough with detail that no reasonable person could call it the writing of a man losing his grip on his own affairs. Your Honor, Jonathan said, Mr. Whitfield ran a real estate portfolio worth several $1,000,000 until the week he died. The only thing that changed in his final year was who he trusted with the truth. The judge recognized the will that afternoon. I didn't feel triumphant when it happened. I mostly just felt tired. The particular exhaustion of finally setting down something you've been carrying so long you forgot what your arms felt like empty. Kendrick did not go to prison. I want to say that plainly, because I know some version of this story wants a courtroom scene with sirens and shouting, and that isn't what happened, and I've come to believe the real version says more than the fantasy would have. The statute of limitations on the original forgery had technically passed, and my father, by absorbing the debt quietly for years, had already resolved the financial harm before anyone else even knew it existed. What Kendrick lost instead was quieter and, I think, harder to carry. The pending line of credit was denied outright once the trust ownership became a matter of record. His standing as informal co-manager of the family hardware business was formally revoked by the board Cecilia now controlled, and the version of himself he'd spent 9 years protecting, the reliable younger brother who'd simply had bad luck, no longer existed for anyone in the family to believe in. Abena still speaks to him. Cecilia does. Carefully. I do not. Not yet. And I've stopped feeling guilty about that. The final piece came from Jonathan almost as an afterthought, delivered the same afternoon the court formally recognized the second will. A detail my grandfather had apparently mentioned to him once, off the record, that he'd asked Jonathan not to repeat unless everything else had already come to light. Grandpa hadn't only been protecting the building from Kendrick. He'd been protecting my father too, in a way none of us had considered. If the forgery had ever become public while my father was still alive, my father, as the person who'd quietly absorbed and hidden a fraudulent loan for years rather than reporting it, would have faced his own exposure for structuring those repayments in a way that avoided drawing attention from the business's accountants. Grandpa's silence hadn't only shielded Kendrick from consequences, it had shielded my father from the fallout of the choice he'd made to protect his brother, a choice Grandpa privately disagreed with but honored anyway, because family, to him, meant carrying each other's mistakes, even when you thought the mistake itself was wrong. That was the twist I hadn't seen coming, foreshadowed all along in a sentence I'd misread as simple sentimentality. The things worth keeping are never kept where anyone expects to find them. He hadn't just been talking about a building. He'd been talking about the whole architecture of what he was choosing to protect, and why. I think about my father differently now. Not as a man who left me $1 because he'd run out of time to say what he meant, though that's still true. As a man who spent the last 9 years of his life quietly carrying a debt that wasn't his, to protect a brother who never knew he was being carried, while also trying to make sure that if the truth ever surfaced, his daughter, the one who'd left the family business, the one everyone assumed had nothing left to lose, would be the one left standing on solid ground. He never got to tell me any of it himself. I used to think that was the tragedy of this whole story. I've come to think the tragedy was smaller and sadder than that. He simply believed there'd be more time, the way most people do, right up until there isn't. There's a saying my grandfather used to repeat when I was young enough to not really understand it, something he claimed his own father told him. A family that never argues about money has usually just stopped telling each other the truth. I understand it now in a way I didn't at 19. Standing in a paint aisle, telling my father I wasn't going to spend my life the way he wanted me to. Money doesn't create the cracks in a family. It just finds the ones that are already there and makes them impossible to ignore. I kept the Halsey Avenue building, not because I needed it. I'd built a life for myself that had nothing to do with real estate or hardware stores or any of it, but because giving it up would have meant treating my grandfather's last act of protection as a burden instead of what it actually was. I hired a management company Cecilia trusts, the same kind of arrangement Grandpa always ran, and I've started using a portion of its income to fund a small scholarship for design students who leave family businesses the way I did, without a map for what comes after. I named it after him. He would have hated the sentimentality of that and pretended not to be moved by it anyway, which is exactly the kind of man he was. I framed the original dollar bill. It sits in my apartment now, not as a wound anymore, but as a reminder of how much room there is between what a thing looks like and what it actually means, and how dangerous it is to let the first interpretation win before you've asked a single real question. For a long time, it stood for the smallest possible acknowledgement a parent could give a child. Now it stands for the last piece of a much larger promise my father never got to finish keeping, and the fact that I went looking instead of simply accepting the version of the story that hurt the least. Cecilia came with me the week I set up the scholarship fund, sitting across from me at my kitchen table while I filled out the paperwork, the framed dollar bill propped against the wall behind us, where I'd hung it a few days earlier. "You could have kept all of it quiet," she said. "The building, the money. You didn't have to tell anyone how you were using it. I didn't do it to be seen doing it. I know. That's not what I meant." She turned her water glass slowly on the table, the way she does when she's building up to something. "I meant that I think I understand now why Dad never told either of us the truth while he was alive. It's not because he thought we couldn't handle it. I think he just never found a version of the story where he came out of it looking like the father he wanted to be for both of us at once." "He was, though," I said, and meant it more than I expected to. "He just didn't get to finish proving it." "No," she agreed. "But you did." For him, I didn't have an answer for that, so I just let it sit between us, the way the truth in this family had apparently always preferred to be handled. Quietly, and only once someone finally had the courage to go looking for it. I went back to Cardigan Street one last time before Cecilia and I finally listed it for sale. I stood in the study where the safe still sat open and empty, the bookshelf pushed aside, afternoon light coming in through a window Grandpa never liked opened. I thought about the porch conversations, the fittings and compression joints, the years of near silence with my father that we'd almost fully repaired before we ran out of time to finish the job. A dollar bill doesn't tell you any of that. A second will barely tells you half of it. What tells you the rest is the willingness to keep asking, long after everyone around you has already decided they know how the story ends. My grandfather was right about one thing more than anything else he ever said to me. The things worth keeping are never kept where anyone expects to find them. Sometimes they're not even kept in a safe at all. Sometimes they're kept in the unfinished sentence a parent runs out of time to say, waiting for someone who loves them enough to go looking for the rest of it.